Okay, next up, we've got something a little bit different. Global sports betting and the role of integrity technology. And knowing this topic and knowing the speaker, I'm giving 2-to-1 odds that this is going to be a great presentation. Known Bill Squadron for a long time. Bill is the special counsel for Genius Sports. Previously, he served as the president of Bloomberg Sports, the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Sport Vision. And also now he's a professor of sports management at Elan. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill. If you have any questions afterwards, we have 2 microphones here, so you can ask Bill.
Thanks, Mark. And I definitely would not encourage you to take those odds. But I'm really delighted to be here today. I thought that last panel was great, and it was interesting that they ended talking about risk-taking and being risk-averse, because we're going to be talking for the next 45 minutes about risk-taking. Different kind of risk-taking, but one that is going to be changing the face of the U.S. sports industry over the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe even a lot sooner than that. It's going to affect all aspects of the sports industry, including all the things we've been talking about the last couple of days, having to do with predictive models, analytics, data-intensive study, leading to how people will, in fact, think about betting on sports. And while it's been a subject that's been kind of off to the side and a little bit, uncertain or shaky, maybe even shady to some people's thinking over the years, I think people are understanding it a lot better now in all its facets, and it's coming. And we're going to talk about it for the next few minutes, and I'd certainly encourage all of you, if you have questions, to note them, and we'll definitely leave some time at the end for questions. So let's get started. And what about the global sports betting market? It's enormous. Okay? It's a massive, massive economy. Okay? Most of it is underground, unregulated, illegal, including here in the United States. Globally, it's said that this market is at least $1 trillion. Okay. Some believe it could be as high as $3 trillion. The former head of the Hong Kong Jockey Club's sports trading desk has offered the opinion that it could be as high as $3 trillion. Right? Only 10% roughly of that is in legal, regulated environments. Most of it occurs out of sight and underground. So how about the U.S.? Well, we all know that the legal sports betting market in the United States at the moment is limited to Nevada, the vast majority of it taking place in Las Vegas. This is a year or so old. I think it actually was a little bit higher last year than the $4.5 billion on this slide. I think it's maybe closer to $6 billion. But even that is a small fraction of the amount of money that's bet on sports in the United States each year. Of course, nobody knows the exact amount because of the very fact that it takes place out of sight and under the table. But it's estimated to be anywhere from $150 billion to as high as $400 billion a year that's being wagered on sports by Americans. They're doing it, in the old-fashioned way with people on the corner, but increasingly they're doing it with offshore betting sites that face into the U.S., that clear these bets with banks that are offshore, and those numbers are increasing as we speak. And the numbers themselves are at least $150 billion. So if you think about what that means in terms of an economic engine, it's enormous. Now, what are the impact of the fact that all of this is taking place illegally? And I think many of you are probably aware that much of the debate started in terms of its public nature a couple of years ago when Adam Silver, the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in which he talked about the fact that while in 1992 Congress passed a law, which is PASPA, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which was designed to stop sports betting at the Nevada border because it exempted Nevada, it didn't work. And in the decades since, sports betting has exploded just out of sight, unmonitored, untaxed, unregulated. And his point in that op-ed piece, which began a lot of people talking about this, was that we are much better off bringing it into the sunshine, taxing it, licensing it, monitoring it, dealing with it properly, than either pretending it doesn't exist or fooling ourselves into thinking we're going to stop it. And in the discussions taken place since that time, many of the strong points that he made have come out, I think, in even greater relief. And it includes the fact that because you've got an illegal market, it's very difficult to see what's happening. It's very difficult to share information. The sports themselves have no idea how their data is being used to support these markets. So official data may be being provided to offshore bookmakers who are then facing illegally into the United States, not necessarily something that a sports governing body would want to see. Okay? And there's no legislation governing it. So, for example, in Australia, when you have allegations of some sort of corruption or match fixing, there are very serious, severe criminal penalties associated with that. When you don't have legislation that deals with a particular area, particularly one that's of such magnitude as the U.S. sports betting market, then you can't control it and you can't deal with it properly. And that was the point he was making. So what does the world look like? Well, you see a gradual shift toward regulating sports betting throughout the world. The green countries, Australia, France, England, Spain, Canada, etc., are countries where betting is now legal, it's regulated, it's monitored, and so forth. The blue countries are sort of countries where there's nothing really happening at the moment at all. It's illegal, but there's really not a lot of activity. The yellow countries are countries where there is quite a bit of illegal sports betting going on, and the countries themselves are moving in one way or another toward a system of regulation, licensing, and legality. The two red countries, China and India, are highlighted there because the market there for unregulated illegal betting is massive. I mean, I think I've seen estimates that in China alone, you've got $500 million to $1 trillion being bet illegally. I mean, I don't think anybody knows the exact amount, but I think what everybody knows is that it's a massive illegal market. Okay? But what you can see from this slide is that this is a very big global economic engine in which countries are dealing with it differently, but the trend is toward what Commissioner Silver wrote in that op-ed piece, which is saying, well, when we've got such a massive economic machine going on, let's deal with it honestly and properly rather than pretend it's not there. So I'm here today in my capacity as special counsel for Genius Sports, a company I've been working with for a couple of years, helping them to grow their business in the United States. It's a global company headquartered in London with our U.S. headquarters in Los Angeles. It's a very interesting company, one I think if you haven't heard about it, you will be hearing about them increasingly over the next couple of years. It's one of the strongest technology, data, and analytics companies in the sports industry globally, with offices in 20 countries and working across federations, governing bodies, betting operators, media companies, and analytics across the board. It's a really interesting company with over 1,000 employees and has been working here in the United States over the past couple of years to explain one key element, which I'm going to get into in a second, which is how analytics and data can provide much more integrity into a sport. So what it really amounts to is an integrity technology service that when sports betting is legal and regulated, allows governing bodies, athletes, and the industry as a whole to have much more confidence in the integrity of the sport than when things are happening out of sight. And you can see here the integrity piece that I've referred to includes relationships with a lot of the major governing bodies around the world, including Major League Baseball and the PGA Tour here in the US, the Premier League in the UK, and many others, including, you may not know that BWF means the Badminton World Federation, but outside the United States, badminton is a major sport in many countries, and one, by the way, on which people bet very frequently. So here's just a quick timeline to show how things are changing, and part of the reason, and I'm really grateful to Mark and to SABR for inviting us here today, and part of the reason for that is this is something that is going to be top of mind in baseball and across the U.S. sports industry over the next couple of years. And it will clearly affect how people look at data and how people look at analytics. So I think it is very timely, and as we're going to touch on in a couple of minutes, may actually be on us much sooner than people can imagine with a pending Supreme Court case that could change everything overnight. But just over the past couple of years, Genius Sports has been working with Major League Baseball, providing integrity technology, monitoring the global betting markets across baseball. We'll take a look at something associated with that in a minute. Working closely with law enforcement, providing educational sessions to explain how integrity monitoring and integrity technology work. Just recently announced a partnership with the PGA Tour to provide all kinds of educational and support services for the tour with respect to betting integrity. Now, why does it matter? What's important about it? Why, I think that's something we don't have to dwell on here. Everybody knows that confidence in a sport's integrity, in the fairness and the unpredictability, really, of a competition is absolutely essential to fans' confidence in that sport. I mean, we certainly have seen the impact that substance abuse, PEDs, steroids have had across multiple sports, from cycling to baseball and across the board. And when people's confidence is eroded because they don't believe that a competition is fair and they have their doubts about how people are competing with each other according to the rules, it threatens to undermine the entire sport. And so, you know, if you are going to move toward a legal and regulated betting market, you need to maximize the efforts you make in the area of ensuring integrity. The one point I would make, which I think is very important for people to bear in mind, is that to the degree that integrity of a sport is an issue with a regulated market, it is equally, if not more so, an issue with an unregulated market that takes place out of sight. And we've all seen, you know, occasional instances of problems with matches, whether it's with officials or with athletes. And this has taken place even though betting is prohibited, okay? So in other words, it doesn't make it more susceptible to corruption because you make it legal and regulated. In fact, what you do is you create the opportunity to monitor and address it in a much more effective way, so you've actually reduced the risk. And that's why, you know, having integrity addressed openly and discussed openly is the best way to deal with the potential problem. Sorry. So this is the way an integrity service works. So you may be asking yourself, well, what does integrity technology really consist of? Well, when you go in and begin working with a governing body, what you do is you first look at how the governing body is set up to deal with and educate people throughout the structure in the organization, all the way from athletes to officials to the front office, to everyone throughout the sport, right? And so you set up a real analysis of that. You establish rules that make sense. You then go through an education process. Then the technology itself engages in monitoring the markets throughout the world, and we'll look at that in a second. And then that's followed by the compiling of reports, and where appropriate, investigations will ensue to deal with problems that have been flagged in the monitoring part of the process. So you can see all the different pieces. It's a fairly complex system, but what you've got is inputs from various sources. So on the left, you have the sports official data feed, so you're looking at that data coming in live during the match. And you're syncing that up with an analysis of the betting markets as they're taking place. So you see global betting data in the middle there. What that represents is sports betting operators, often called bookmakers, who are operating largely today online, and you're able to get, either because they're making it available as required by law or because they're making it available under agreement, you're having a look at their odds as they're taking place in real time. And you're looking at that across the entire globe of regulated betting markets. You then have that correlated to predictive models. So what does that mean? Well, it means that Genius Sports, like a couple of other companies around the world, has developed very sophisticated predictive models that apply to each particular game taking place. Whether it's a badminton game in the second division in Pakistan, or whether it's an NFL game, right? These models basically allow you to look at the score, the activities in the game, injuries, weather, all kinds of factors as they're taking place in real time, and create a model that will show you what the odds should be at any particular time during that game. Now, why is that important? Because when we think of betting, I mean, most of us think about, okay, well, when does the game start? Oh, a couple hours. Who's favored? Oh, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. Maybe I'll put a few dollars on the underdog. What's the line if I'm thinking about a football game? You're thinking about these things, in sort of very linear terms, right? But the fact is that the betting markets, and this will be the reality here before we all know it, are dynamic and real time. What does that mean? More money is bet in the UK, which is the most advanced and mature legal betting market, after a game begins by a long shot than before the game. At this point, as much as I think 65%, it may even be over that now, is bet after a game begins. So that means that the odds are changing constantly. People are watching these games on television, on their computer, on their phone, and they're betting in real time, and they're betting not just on the outcome of the game, okay? So it's not just, okay, the sixth inning's just finished, it's 2-1, Tigers are trailing, but I think they're gonna win. What are my odds? And I'm gonna put down $10 or more on the Tigers to win the game, okay? In real time. But it's not just that, as we'll see, because it may be that you don't just want to bet on who's going to win the game, you want to bet on whether the Tigers are going to score in the next inning. Or you might want to bet on how many outs there are going to be in the next inning before a relief pitcher is brought in. Okay? These kinds of propositions characterize the betting markets throughout the world today. One of the things that we've found as we've begun to talk to people on Capitol Hill, in state legislative offices, around the country on this issue is that because this country outside of Nevada has really not engaged with this kind of activity openly for decades and decades, there's really not a lot of awareness of how these markets have developed and evolved and become really robust, dynamic, and real time, over the last few years. And so, what we're looking to here is not just a sort of simple, I'm going to go down to the corner or go online and put down $10 on whether my favorite team is going to win tomorrow. It's a much more engaged and dynamic market that's real-time, live, and we'll look at it in a second. And what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things, of course, but one of the things it means for sports, baseball, let's talk about that in particular, but for all sports, it means significantly increased engagement with fans. Because what all studies have shown, Nielsen's done a lot of work on this in particular, is that when there is a legal and regulated betting market and people are engaged in betting, and particularly when it's real time and you can do it as the game is going on, ratings go up, engagement goes up, people's attendance goes up. So, certainly if you are a league, one of the things you're looking at is not just, as we all saw in the daily fantasy space, when there was that explosion of ads from DraftKings and FanDuel, huge amounts of sponsorship money and advertising money associated with a regulated and legal industry, but you're also looking at significantly increased television ratings and engagement with fans. That's all a part of what we're going to be seeing as this begins to be part of the part of the space. So as you can see, the bottom part of this slide, what happens is, all of these inputs then go into a monitoring system, and what that results in is the ability of that system automatically. It all happens, there's no human intervention because you're looking at thousands of games going on around the world at a time, okay? Able to compare betting market information with the predictive models, with the official data coming in, taking into account all the other factors that have been put into the model, and the ability to flag what appear to be aberrational patterns in the betting markets. And when the system flags an abnormal betting situation, it will then be looked at more carefully to see if there's an explanation. And if there doesn't appear to be an obvious explanation, maybe somebody got injured, unexpectedly and it hadn't been taken into account yet, whatever it happens to be, if there isn't an obvious explanation, there's a deeper inquiry. And if there's still not an obvious explanation, then that pattern and that situation is turned over to the appropriate governing body to undertake a further investigation. And that's the way the system will work. And I can show you a specific example of that. So this is a predictive model of a soccer game, right? And let me see if I can do this. What you can see here is, this line represents the odds of a particular team winning as the game goes along, okay? And what we're now going to look at is, okay, so what we're talking about here is a game where the orange line represents the predictive model. The blue line represents the actual information coming in from the betting markets. Now, those lines should be fairly similar. The blue line represents the data that's coming in from monitoring betting markets around the world. This, right about here, is the 61st minute of play. The game is 0-0 at this point in time. And at that point, what we're looking at is the odds of a particular team, in this case the away team, winning the game, right? And it's pretty close, so there's not much of a significant differential. But at the 61st minute, there's suddenly a big change in the numbers that the betting markets are showing versus the predictive model. It's actually a 15% differential, which is a huge gap based on what you would normally expect. And what happens then is that as the game goes further and further along, the odds of a particular team, any team, the away team or the home team winning, get less and less, and that's what you're seeing here. The odds of the away team winning get less and less, and yet the betting markets are not reflecting that. What that means is that a lot of money is coming in on a particular team, keeping those odds from reflecting what the model would normally show. And right up here at the 78th minute, whereas you can see this steep curve, you would be expecting a team to have a very dramatically decreasing chance of winning because there's only 12 minutes left in the game and it's 0-0. And yet, the markets aren't reflecting that, and what do you know, at the 78th minute, the away team scores a goal and ends up winning 1-0. And so this is a situation where, without any other explanation associated with it, it's clearly suspicious activity that would be turned over to the appropriate governing body or federation for further investigation. Okay? So that's an example of that. Now, I want to show you just for a minute kind of what we're really talking about, because I would suspect that a lot of you have not actually seen much of what we're really looking at. So this is a website that is operated by one of the top publicly traded British betting operators. And again, to sort of create the right context, in the UK, this is just another industry with publicly traded companies and thousands of employees and activities that people engage in every day without really thinking twice about it, okay? It is foreign to many of us here because it's been illegal in so much of this country for so long, but that's not the case elsewhere, okay? And so this site, while you can look at it, I could tell you that if you tried to place a bet from here, it would block you, hopefully. But, no, it will. But you can at least look at it, and I would actually encourage all of you to spend a little time on it because it's very educational if you're interested in learning about this space. I mean, among other things, you know, what you can do, just see here. Sorry. Just trying to kind of calibrate this a little bit. Okay, so here's today, right? And, you know, here are odds on exhibition baseball, preseason baseball, okay? So, you know, just because you can't bet on these games here doesn't mean you can't bet on them in London and that people aren't doing it. And believe me, these operators would not be offering this if there weren't people interested in betting on it, right? And there are all kinds of other bets that they offer to people. So if you look here, future baseball. So you can bet on the amount of wins that any team is going to get this season. You can bet even on, let's take a look at this. I thought this was sort of interesting. How many wins Chris Sale is going to get this season, how many wins Corey Kluber is going to get this season. See if we can go down. I even think you can bet on how many wins Ohtani is going to get. Let's see. Yep, there you go. So he's never thrown a pitch in a major league game, but you can bet on how many wins he's going to get, all right? So these are just the kinds of propositions, the list. You can bet on who's going to win the MVP. You can bet on all kinds of things. I can spend a lot of time on this site. I would encourage you just to do it just to sort of see what it's like. And part of the reason I would urge you to do it is that one of the things we have the opportunity to do in this country is to learn from how other countries have dealt with this, okay? One of the things that's going on now, because all the leagues recognize that this is potentially coming, are people are thinking about what is the most effective way, the best way to protect the integrity of the sport, to ensure that it's a rational and sound system to be put in place, what kinds of bets should be allowed, right? What is the right way to organize the market, what kinds of things should be allowed before a game, during a game, okay? All of this is opportunity for us because there's always benefit in a way from being second into something because you get to learn from how others have done it. And the UK market is one that's actually been very successful, but like anything else, maybe not perfect or maybe not with characteristics that exactly mirror ours and should be copied in the way that we want to do things here. So one of the real opportunities we have is to learn from how it's been done elsewhere, and as we move toward legal licensed markets, do it in a way that's most effective and most appropriate for the US sports industry. And every sport, I think, is beginning to look at this pretty carefully, and one of the reasons for that is that this may be on us faster than we know. So some of you may have read that the Supreme Court, to many people's surprise, recently heard a case that was a challenge by New Jersey to the federal law that prohibits sports betting everywhere but Nevada. Okay? And that oral argument took place in December. The decision will be announced within the next few months. It could be as early as April, but certainly by June. And based on the oral argument, which, I was a lawyer in my previous existences, some of the things I did before I started Sport Vision, I sort of urge people not to read too much into what Supreme Court justices ask at oral argument because it's a hard tea leaf to read. But many people believe the Supreme Court is going to find the federal law that prohibits sports betting unconstitutional. And if they do that, this could be upon us as early as June. And already, many states have passed laws positioning themselves to move into this market if the Supreme Court overturns the federal law called PASPA. Okay, now, I would say to you that even if the Supreme Court upholds that law and does not open the floodgates all of a sudden, we will see Congress change the law over the next couple of years. There is essentially a consensus across many parts of the industry, whether it's, whether it's the NBA having taken the lead, but others beginning to understand the strength of the argument that having an invisible, illegal, multi-hundred-billion-dollar market is not in anyone's interest. And if we're not going to be able to stop it, we're much better off dealing with it honestly, openly, licensing it, taxing it, regulating it, monitoring it, and dealing with it properly. There's enough of a movement in that direction, and even law enforcement, by the way, has strongly endorsed taking something that they can't stop and don't want to spend resources stopping, and believe feeds organized crime, feeds drugs, sex trafficking, other things that you really do want to deal with, and prefer to bring it out in the open and deal with it as a legal regulated industry. So, when you're predicting how Congress will act and how quickly they may move to change the law, that's not a bet I would urge anyone to take. But I will say to you that it's almost certain that even if the Supreme Court does not rule PASPA unconstitutional and change the landscape that way, you will have at some point over the next couple of years congressional action that will turn this from an illegal market to a legal one. So this is coming. It could be on us, like I said, extremely soon, as early as this spring. I would be surprised if you would actually see states be able to move quickly enough to begin taking bets for this coming baseball season. But it's not inconceivable because there's a lot of money out there, and as you all know, when there's tax dollars at stake and licensing dollars at stake and sponsorship dollars and advertising dollars, that tends to incentivize people to move pretty quickly. But the one thing you can be certain of is that if the Supreme Court does rule in favor of New Jersey, that by the 2019 baseball season, this will be in full gear. Okay. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions about any aspects of this. I'm happy to talk about the technology that's involved or the legal issues that the Supreme Court's looking at or the business issues affecting the coming sports betting industry from any of you.
Question relating to that soccer game you just showed in the graphic. What were the consequences of that irregularity? Who went into action? What was the result?
So, I'm sure you won't be surprised for me to tell you that I can't give any, part of the reason there are no names of teams or federations on there is that, as a company that provides these services, we can't disclose specific instances. But what I can tell you is there was recently a fairly celebrated instance where FIFA received inputs from 5 different monitoring companies who were looking at particular aberrational situations and took action against a referee who clearly had been involved in some highly suspicious activities. So the way it will work, and often, as you can imagine, if there is a problem that's identified, sometimes it will get publicity. I mean, there have been corruption cases that have been high profile in recent years. I mean, the India Premier League, they had a fairly celebrated match-fixing case. I think it cost them a $70 million sponsorship with Pepsi, if I remember the report correctly. So, I mean, these things have major consequences, and, I think Major League Baseball was, really a leader and pretty visionary in stepping forward a couple of years ago to say, look, we know it's illegal here, but we also know people do these things in connection with betting on baseball outside the United States. We want to be as vigilant and as progressive as possible and at least being as educated and informed as we can be. And so it definitely will flag things that people need to address.
Yeah, when you talk about the various states possibly opening it up to legalization, it reminds me of what's been going on with the marijuana business. In both cases, kind of wonder why now, it took so long. And think about New Jersey. New Jersey's had casinos since the late 80s, haven't they?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. You know, in the conversations I've had over the past couple of years with, you know, real range of people and different kinds of stakeholders associated with this, a lot of them have drawn analogies to prohibition and said, well, you know, we tried to stop something that people wanted to do anyway, and it was much better served to deal with it openly and not just try to stop it. I think the marijuana analogy is a close one that some people might draw. But, you know, in some ways, the other piece that people have pointed to is that for states to think about this as a matter of first impression is really not right, because virtually every state, I think it's every state but one, has a state lottery. And state lotteries are the most pure gambling that exists. I mean, at least in baseball, people will be talking to all of you folks about how your analytics and insights can help them with their own predictive models to make some money once this becomes part of the landscape. But with the lottery, you're just rolling it, you know, you're just spinning a wheel, right? So there's not any skill involved, and many people said it's the most regressive form of gambling there is. So, you know, when people do raise or question whether there's an issue of morality here, you know, look, I mean, people are entitled to their opinion about that, but I can tell you that my view has been that, you know, I don't understand how you can have a lottery in every state and then, you know, sort of be shocked to think about gambling.
Back to enforcement, I would imagine that the FBI and the IRS are very interested in what would happen after this became more transparent, more broadly accepted and legalized throughout the country, because I would expect that issues related to corruption, say a corrupt umpire or some sort of situation like Pete Rose's betting on only the Reds to win, would eventually result in either IRS or Justice Department investigations and possibly prosecutions.
Well, I mean, I think it ties to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is that, you know, when you deal with it, you know, openly and properly, you can put in place both in legislation, state law, potentially federal law, and league regulations about what's permissible and what isn't. And you then, of course, have enforcement that flows from that. You know, I think that the advantage we have is the opportunity to really think it through and come up with a sound structure that cuts across these things. I mean, I don't know what kind of rules will be in place about athletes engaging in betting, but I would be surprised if leagues would permit them to. I mean, just because it becomes legal doesn't mean you're going to be permitted to do it. I mean, again, I'm just speculating myself, but all that I'm saying is that, you know, you're going to have a whole series of rules and laws that address this, just like any other industry. You know, we have tons of regulated industries in this country, and of course there are enforcement mechanisms. Look at the financial services industry, and there you have live markets that have to be monitored all the time for things that are improper when people, you know, don't behave. There are always going to be people that don't behave.
I think this is going to result in an automated strike zone before you know it.
That's another conversation I'm happy to have with you.
A quick follow-up on the comparison to the drug legalization question. So in that area, we've seen states basically ignore the federal government and legalize it and you know, wait for the federal government either to do something or not do something. Is there a significant legal difference in the status of sports betting that has prevented that from happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we know that there's a federal law that makes marijuana illegal, and states have moved ahead to make it legal anyway, and now it's potentially a confrontation because the new administration has a different view than the previous administration. The difference with PASPA, the federal law that prohibits sports betting, is that it actually authorizes the leagues to bring suit to block any state. It's an unusual law, and in fact, one of the reasons people believe it may be ruled unconstitutional is because it's such an unusually structured law. the constitutional argument against PASPA has been made under the 10th Amendment, which is the amendment that's rarely invoked that essentially reserves to states the right to do anything the federal government doesn't preempt. Part of the reason it's been rarely invoked is that the Supreme Court over the centuries has sort of considered it a truism and has only reversed found laws unconstitutional under the 10th Amendment, either in part or in whole, I think 4 times in the last 70 years. It's very rarely used, which is why I think some of us who are more conservative from the legal side think it still is far from certain that the court is going to rule for New Jersey. But getting back to your basic question, part of the unusual nature of the law, by giving the leagues the power to block the states, it's not just an issue with the federal government. And in fact, as some of you may know, the case coming out of New Jersey originated as NCAA, NFL, MLB, NBA, and NHL versus New Jersey, not the Justice Department bringing suit. Any other questions? I know oh, sorry, one more. This is the last one, and then I won't keep you guys from lunch.
Do you think that DraftKings and FanDuel are really gambling sites masquerading as fantasy league sites?
I think they've made a strong argument that daily fantasy is a game of skill as opposed to a game of chance. I can't say I've been persuaded by that. They have persuaded a lot of other people of that. I would recommend all of you, or recommend to all of you, both because it's hilarious and because I think it's right on point, the segment that John Oliver did on this topic a couple of years ago. I think I would say that it's really in sync with the way I would look at it. Plus, it's hilarious. So next time you guys go online, if you haven't seen the John Oliver segment on Daily Fantasy, I'd highly recommend it to you.